Good morning, you lucky devils. Have you heard the good news? You're going to. I'm going to read you a story that is 100% true, and I can prove this. This story is true, and this story matters a lot. I'll explain. The story goes like this. Now, I'm reading this without my glasses on, so you'll have to bear with me. Or not. And it was nearing the feast of the Passover, which the Jews keep as a sacred holiday. And the city was thronging with people. And they were boisterous and blah, blah, blah. And they brought forth from among the crowd a homeless man. I'm going to translate words, or I'm going to use words, right? They brought forth from among them a homeless man, and they stripped him naked of his rags, and they dressed him in purple and fine raiment and regalia, and they placed a crown of thorns upon his head. And they mounted him on an ass, and they paraded him through the city, shouting, Hosanna, and like things. And they thrashed him with sticks, and pelted him with garbage from the street, and spit on him, and bowed down before him, and mocked him, saying, Behold the King of the Jews. The party of the Herodians were upset by this, and they caused him to be brought before the Roman governor, saying, This man has disturbed the peace. This man, people proclaim him a king, which is contrary to our laws, and more importantly, your laws, and he must be put to death. They are apparently asking for the 40 lashes, which that means to be lashed to death, to be flogged to death. And the man had no family, but there were several of those who knew him, saying, He's not in his right mind. He has been feeble-minded since he was a boy. He's not responsible. He was dragged along by the crowd. But the party of the Herodians hardened their hearts, saying, Nevertheless, your law, our law, he must be put to death. And the governor of Rome said, I find no legal culpability in this man. But to keep you vultures happy, I shall give him 39 lashes. Now, this is, he commuted his sentence from death to being whipped half to death. This was common. This story is true. And I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, well, yeah, it's about Jesus and Pilate in Jerusalem in 39 AD. No, this story is true, and I will prove it, and I will show you. But this story is not about Jesus, and it's not about Pilate, and it's not even about Jerusalem. This story is all about the money.
The very word secrecy is repugnant in a free and open society.
You're in violation of secure communication procedures, Commodore.
So we just went ahead and fixed the glitch.
There is no America. There is no democracy.
Our fifth objective, a new world order.
There are no nations. There are no peoples. There are no Russians. There are no Arabs. There are no third worlds. There is no West.
Right-wing conspiracy.
What do you call it when the assassins accuse the assassin?
A new world order.
Thank you for plugging in to the Stones Unturned podcast.
Well, just a second there, Professor. We fixed the glitch.
I'm your host, Professor Thomas Henry Horan.
He reads everything.
You better bet your bippies he reads everything. Let me explain something. This story is true. It is verified by historical documents. It does not take place in Jerusalem. It does take place in 39 AD. Why does that matter? The Bible gives us two chronologies for Jesus, for their Jesus. Matthew says he's born 2 years before the death of Herod the Great. We can pinpoint that to 6 BC. Luke says he was born in the census of Quirinius. We can pinpoint that to 6 AD. Those are 12 years apart. The two parallel chronologies run 12 years apart. Little facts in the gospel stories that we can verify, they run 12 years apart. According to both stories, after 33 years of running around telling everybody to be nice to each other, the tax collector nailed him to a telephone pole. So for Matthew, that's 26-27 AD, which is when Pontius Pilate does arrive to take up his duties as prefect in Judea. Bear in mind that every few years there's a shuffle and there's a restructuring of the arrangement with Rome and blah, 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 blah. And we're talking about over 100-year period here of very intense history. So according to Luke, that would be 39 AD, and that would be the end of Pilate's prefecture in Judea. That's a very interesting coincidence. But this story is true, but it's not about Jesus or Pilate or Jerusalem. But it does take place in 39 AD. Now we have a problem. There is no record of any major rioting or disturbances in or around Jerusalem in 39 AD. There is a record of a massive, peaceful, nonviolent demonstration in Jerusalem in 39 AD. But the authorities, they get the situation under control and they chill everybody out, and everybody ends up living, they're not happily ever after, but things continue to chug along for another 30 years, almost 30 years, 20 to 30 years. So where does this story come from? One of the funny things about the New Testament is almost all of it takes place in the old Seleucid Empire. Ephesus, Corinth, Antioch, blah, blah, blah. Paul never goes to Egypt. But all the Gospels, they're all, whatever scraps we have, they all come from Egypt. That's because you don't understand what was going on at the time. The way it really worked was, Egypt was not at that time a province owned by the Senate and people of Rome. Egypt was a private, it's like a crown colony of the Caesars. Augustus claimed Egypt legally as a patrimony, a private money-making machine, a private colony. That's interesting because after Octavian, after Augustus, the next level of stability is Tiberius, known in his youth as Biberius, because he used to drink like a fish. He apparently develops Alzheimer's or something and goes a little crazy. So, his Heinrich Himmler, the prefect of the Praetorian Guard, a prefect is a deputy commander. The commander of the Praetorian Guard, his bodyguard, Sejanus, starts to kind of rule from the shadows. He's like Heinrich Himmler, he's like Martin Bormann. And like Heinrich Himmler and Martin Bormann, he's starting to siphon off a significant amount of money. To do this, he maneuvers his people into key positions. And this includes the prefect of Judea, Pontius Pilate. It also includes, what's his name? Flaccus? Who was Flaccus? Let me get his full name. This is not Pontius Pilate. This is Quaelius Valerius Flaccus. No. 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 Aulus Aurelius Flaccus. Prefect of Roman Egypt from 33 to 39. This costs him his job. This is the story, but it's not about Jesus, Pilate, and Jerusalem. This is about a man named Carabas, Flaccus, and Alexandria. This is what has been really going on. There's a lot of confusion, and and you've gotten a lot of it from this podcast so far. I have tried to reconstruct the history of the Bible and the Bible texts and who wrote them and who read them based purely on their theologies and philosophies and cosmologies. This is not possible. It doesn't fit. It just doesn't fit. When you realize that, well, first of all, in that time, chronology didn't mean a whole lot. There was the past, there was the sequence of events. The actual dates meant nothing to these people. They would think you were crazy. And they tended to rewrite history to suit present conditions. So it's not totally surprising, but it's really surprising because apparently, as a result of what happens in the mid-1st century among the Jews, the Romans reformed their own system pretty extensively. In fact, this is the real transition between the Republic, which is just 12 or so mafia families operating a smash and grab protection racket, which is what Pilate's doing there. They transition to a modern, bureaucratic, paper-pushing, nation-building superstate. This is what, and it's primarily because of this. It's not only because of the political and social disruption, but, now brace yourselves, I'm going to let you in on a little secret here. This is the Easter egg of Easter eggs. It's actually all about the money. I will give you a moment to recover from the shock. It's all about the money. It's been about the money since 6000 BC, and I will show you that. It's been about the same syndicate of money changers. I will show you that. But that's not what they were. You'll see. You'll see. Well, against all odds, Caligula, it was officially called Caligula, becomes emperor. This is a problem for Pilate and Flaccus and a lot of other people because they owe their jobs to the influence of Sejanus, and Sejanus has been on Caligula's shit list for a while. Not only did Tiberius have Caligula's mother assassinated, starved to death, Flaccus actually is the officer who's responsible for supervising this. Well, sir, when was this? It just so happens that Herod the Great's grandson, Agrippa I, there's been this complicated arrangement. The Romans don't want a strong client king who can break away from Rome. They want this province divided. They want internal dissent. It's like the English in Czechoslovakia or Iraq, right? The English drew those maps deliberately to make those countries internally weak. That's what the Romans are, under the old republic, this is what they're trying to do, because it's all smash and grab. It's just all what they can get. Later on, they will reform their system. So at this time, Caligula and Herod went to boarding school together. Agrippa lived with Caligula when they were boys, and they went to school together. They're very close friends. Now that Caligula is emperor, he summons Herod to Rome, and he drapes Herod in purple. But here's a detail most historians overlook because it doesn't fit the story. He doesn't dress Herod and proclaim him a client king. He dresses him in senatorial purple, the toga with the purple sash. He makes Herod a senator. Before this, a prefect or even procurator. That job title changes over time. And this is one of the reasons why. Would have legal authority over the local client king. So that's not Herod. Herod's been elevated to not only a king, a soci, but also a senator. Now he outranks both Flaccus and Pilate and a lot of other people. But the people who are supposed to be, up until now, have kept him on a leash, now they're in his leash. And to make things even more fun, they've been on Caligula's shit list. Caligula, for the first 6 months, is hailed as the savior of the world. He's doing everything great. Then he suffers a major illness. We don't know if it was an attack of malaria and encephalitis. We don't know if it was just a nervous breakdown. He was raised by Tiberius to be a brutal dictator, and this is what he is. When he comes out of his, and he's like for a day or so, they can't tell if he's alive or dead. Well, he recovers miraculously. Except now he's just as smart and just as shrewd and just as ruthless and just as ambitious, except now he's paranoid. Well, he's got a lot of reasons to be paranoid. He suspects that he was poisoned, and he probably was. But he's smart. He doesn't just go around machine gunning people. Little Caesar is out. This is the modern world. We must be administrators. We must be bureaucrats. So he sends Herod on a tour. And he sends Herod to his private colony first. He sends him to Egypt first. And Herod sails into Alexandria Harbor wearing his purple and being proclaimed by a certain party of Jews. Now, this is where the distinction between Sadducee and Pharisee gets blurred and where people get confused. Some of them proclaim him as king. This is important because, unlike history, this is the first time in history where there is an actual record of an actual legal entity called the Greater Kingdom of Israel, which includes both Judea and the Benjamin Heights and Galilee and all these other territories. Herod is full king of a united kingdom of Israel that historians, that didn't exist before, but they've always dreamed of it. We'll get to that too. But then, okay, this offends almost everybody. Wearing purple would offend everybody. Nobody put up with this. Everybody, if Donald Trump put on purple, that would be the last straw, right? You'd think. Nobody, this offends everybody. But the people whose bread is buttered on the side of Herod and now Caligula, they proclaim this. Later on, when he arrives in Jerusalem, a lot of people are upset, but on the other hand, they're no longer under the thumb of the Roman prefects and procurators. They now have a king. The Roman prefects and procurators are now just like ambassadors, but it's a little. So a lot of people swallow it. They grumble, and they've instituted a system where they rotate the priesthood. Okay, but in Alexandria, there's another mob of people, and they grab this homeless guy and they strip off his rags and they dress him in the purple and they cover him with all the goodies, and they go through this thing. And this is a fool king. This is a traditional fool king thing. Anthropologists think it goes back to a time when the king was literally sacrificed. Maybe it was. By Roman times, this was a barely tolerated, but tolerated form of social protest and blowing off political steam. They deliberately choose a man who can be acquitted by the authorities on a defense of he's legally insane. He's not mentally competent. He didn't do this. They do this on purpose. He will take the blame. He will be the scapegoat for the protest, but the authorities will let him off because he's not fully responsible. He was literally dragged along by the crowd. This man's name was Carabbas. Not Barabbas, Carabbas. And this was probably done on purpose. This whole thing was undoubtedly engineered by Caligula. This is deliberately to embarrass Flaccus. But he doesn't want to just machine gun Flaccus. Now he's got Flaccus under his thumb. Because Flaccus is the man who knows where all the sacks of gold are buried. Because this is a very wealthy province and is the private. He can't just machine gun Flaccus because, right, business is business. But he wants Flaccus under his thumb. Flaccus and Pilate are now sitting on a throne of nails, wearing crowns of thorns with a flaming sword of Damocles dipped in poison dangling over their heads by a Pharisee's whisker. And this is exactly where Caligula wants them. He wants them to sweat as loud as possible. But this period of time when Sejanus is running the empire from the shadows and using his plants like Flaccus and Pilate to siphon off money into his private account, their friends' private accounts, this is really important because now Caligula wants the books audited. There's a catch. You don't know about the Jewish temple at Alexandria. You've never been told about this. I will summarize this very briefly now. When Alexander conquers Syria, he doesn't upset the apple cart like he does in some other places. He's on very friendly terms with the Ammonites and their cousins who ruled Jerusalem. And he kind of leaves things the way they are, apparently. We don't see a big change right away. Up until now, the temple has been dominated by, and we're going to go back to Hezekiah, the real founder of the temple. We're going to go back to Hezekiah later. But the Jews, the lawyers, see, there's two rounds of this. The ones from Judah who have been, they're inculcated, they're indoctrinated in this Persian dualistic Zoroastrian version of Judaism, which they bring back with them. They're pretty much the ancestors of the Pharisees. The Pharisees keep the law, but they also accept the prophets. Sumerians and the pseudo-Zadokites do not. Now, there's this bullshit story about when they come home and they go back to going to rebuild the temple and they go through the foundation stones and they find a copy of the law, Deuteronomy. This is all bullshit. This is all Ptolemaic propaganda. But Ptolemaic propaganda, they're taking Persian propaganda and they're rewriting it. So I'll go through all this ad nauseum, believe me. But here's where we are in 39 AD. Herod Agrippa has been proclaimed the king of the Jews. And both sides of this. So some greedy, some probably bankrupt Alexandrian Ptolemaic merchants, they conspire with some Romans. I don't know if we know their names. Some greedy, hungry Roman merchants. I showed you this a little bit, right? How they jump across all this and they make friends with the Nabateans, and the Nabateans support the Edomites, who support some religious fanatics who overthrow the original Persian-friendly, Seleucid-friendly priesthood, and they install some phony Zadokites. See, people put on Jew face and put on the fancy robes, and they call them so they're called, I'm going to call them Sadducees. These are now it's not an instantaneous polarizing of factions, but there's a lot of whispering, there's a lot of rumoring, there's a lot of embarrassment that goes on. And the ones who are displaced by these new pseudo-Zadokites to start extracting tax money for the Roman mafia, they call themselves Pharisees, and they create the synagogue system. Why is this important? Because the Zadokites have a monopoly on the legal archives and the law schools, right? Jesus talks about the jots and tittles of the law. You have these old copies of the law, which are consonants only. There are no diacriticals, there are no vowels. The jots and tittles are not there. This leaves the law open to interpretation by the priests. This is something priests have always done, because they are also law courts. Are you with me? So at some point, the Alexandrian Jews, the Romans call them Jews, and it's not just about Judea. It's all about the people who live in the Jewish quarter south of the river, right across from the marketplaces in the Senate. The Romans call them Jews. They're part of a larger syndicate that weren't called Jews. I'll come back to that later. You have a very, very, very important financial center, and this is why. What Hezekiah has done, and I'll go back to this in more detail, he has consolidated all the little folk temples on top of all the hills, consolidated them into one national bank. Temples were used as banks. Time goes by. Empires come and go. It's all about grabbing the money. It is all about grabbing the money. So the Jews are allowed to collect the taxes and pay them to the Seleucids or whoever. But apparently, now maybe this was false flag, but this guy calling himself Antiochus Epiphanes, he decides he wants to put a statue of himself in the temple and be worshipped as a god. Does this sound familiar? This causes riots, blah, 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 blah. And this is the opportunity for the Alexandrian Sadducees to plant their, and this has something to do with Jesus ben Sirach and his grandson, to plant their law professors in the temple and control who, and why would it matter? Why the hell would the rest of the world care about which Jewish lawyer is recognized by the temple law school or not? Because they operate the global financial system, not so much as a corporation yet, but more than a trade association. It's a syndicate. And just very quickly, everywhere they go, it's commerce as a service. They are referred to usually as the keepers of the scale, and then this service kind of grows. So when you go to a marketplace, it's kind of like you go to, there's still some stores like this. Some department stores are actually like little independent shops, but you pay for it all at one cash register, and then they divvy up the money, and then they also collect the sales tax while they're there. It's like there's a business like this that's still around. You know what I'm talking about. Kind of like Amazon. It's a lot like Amazon, but it's physically present. They handle international currency exchange. So let's say I go to the market in Aqaba and I want to buy camel for my caravan, and I ask Ahmed, I say, how much is that camel? And he says 3 guru, which would be approximately, a guru was about 10 bushels. I'm going to round it off to 400 pounds of barley. That's a pretty big chunk of change. 48 bushels of barley today is how much? And then I would say, well, how much is that in copper? How much is that in salt? How much is that in wool? Well, we'll go see the money changer. We don't call them money changers. It was called the keeper of the scale. And this, it grows, okay? I want to buy, Ahmed has a cousin in Baghdad. I want his cousin to deliver 3 camels to my cousin in Baghdad. Now you're looking at a chunk of metal money. It would be insane to ship that over land. What the syndicate provides is Ahmed and I can go to the bank, which is, that's a French word for, it's a booth. But, like a booth. When you go to a restaurant and you want to sit in a booth, you're sitting at a banquette. So it's a place where you sit, and it's an independent service. They have deals everywhere they go with the local ruler. And the advantage to this is, I know if Ahmed and I go to Shmuel, the keeper of the scales, and I say, credit my nephew's account in Baghdad so he can buy 3 camels from Ahmed's cousin, and we get together and we do this deal for a price. It's all written down on paper. It's all written down on paper. And as a matter of fact, it's not written down on scrolls. It's written down, first, they're actually loose leaf file folders. They were like this. This is exactly what it was. And it was this. It was a file folder full of paper. And eventually they bind these together, and there's a reason why they bind them together in a codices. That's very interesting. I'll get to that later. Maybe I'll tell you now. They become collateralized debt obligations. It's all paper. And then they have their couriers who keep, for big transactions in particular. But if I know I have an account in Baghdad, I can do this. And no money has to be shipped. So nobody gets robbed. And the price in Baghdad will be accepted because the price has been set by the syndicate. These are standard prices, standard exchange rates, standard weights and measures, standard rules, terms of service. One of the terms of service is you agree that in the case of a dispute, all disputes will be handled at the syndicate court, which is probably presided over by the keeper of the scales. Now, this becomes a bigger, more sophisticated operation, especially in bigger cities. But it works. It works. It's not only a shopping network, it is a financial network. And they develop financial instruments every bit as sophisticated, or stupid if you prefer, as we have today. It's not practical. You read these stories in the Bible. So-and-so, it's not Jeroboam. Who pays Hiram of Byblos 150 talents of gold for gaudy furnishings for this Trumpian temple? It's exactly the same. It's exactly the same. He didn't. Do you know how many donkeys it would take? It's just like Yamashta's gold. No, it wasn't. What he did was he sent a letter to the bank in Byblos and said, please transfer 150 talents of gold from my reserves to Hiram's reserves. And there wasn't any gold. They're gold certificates. That's all they are. Silver certificates. Collateralized debt obligations, letters of credit. Please extend to my friend Shmuel the same courtesy and hospitality you would extend to me. This means loan him as much money as you would loan me, but no more. Loan him money to buy the things I would buy. Lapis lazuli, tin. Don't loan him money to buy things I wouldn't buy. Hashish, whatever. That's what those letters of credit mean. Now, from the time of, who's the first Hasmonean Basileus, the quasi-king? They have been using the temple treasury as a bank for the benefit of their Roman co-conspirators. This money is being funneled very often to Alexandria, which is then taken over by the Caesars as a patrimony. So now the Caesars have a private Jewish bank, the Temple of Yahweh at Leontopolis, just north of the city center in Alexandria. In the city center, there is a synagogue full of Zadokites. How the hell does that happen? These are probably the old Zadokites and people who would eventually become called Pharisees, not necessarily the new pseudo-Zadokites called Sadducees. It's a little complicated. There's a lot of lying that goes on, a lot of fraud that goes on. There's so much fraud going on. So now they're plugged into what has become the Transnational Federal Reserve Bank of the Syndicate at Jerusalem, which also happens to now be the Sadducees try to monopolize Jerusalem as the law school for the entire syndicate. You see, in the West, the syndicate's internal company policy, internal policy procedures, their law conflicts a lot, and they can't. You can join the syndicate, but the membership requirements are strict, and they're too strict for most Westerners. And this is causing the syndicate is having trouble recovering from the decimation of the Phoenicians by the Romans, which was a hostile takeover. They actually were part of the same syndicate, right? Jew is something that becomes, and because of all of this, and because of these massive reforms in the Roman tax code, this question of who's a Jew and who's not a Jew becomes more and more hair-splitting and becomes more and more politically charged. In the East, it's the syndicate's law and culture are not that different from the widespread natural culture. They don't have this kind of hair-splitting dilemma until the Romans start taking over more and more of the old Seleucid Empire. So they are using their it's factions, the sands shift. So we know that Pompey makes a new arrangement once again, right? He goes there to audit the books, and there's no gold there, just some books. So he puts a client king in charge. This is where the Herodians come in. And they're supposed to start running the temple as a money machine for the Romans. This gives the Romans access to the syndicate, financial, and commercial networks of the East. And now they can kind of rebuild it in their own image in the West. So these tax refugees from Jerusalem show up in Alexandria, and they've had a presence there for a while. And they build a new bank in Leontopolis. The two banks are shuffling paper money back and forth. And this becomes a private bank of the Caesars. Now, Sejanus and his ilk have been siphoning money from the system. As a matter of fact, one of the first conspiracy theories about the Jewish syndicate comes from Cicero, who complains that these, right, he calls them siphons, and he calls them the spider's web. Before, it was just part of the natural world. It's the Romans who come up with all these conspiracy theories because this money keeps going missing. Because there never was any money there in the first place. I bring it up because all the copies of the Gospels we can find were all produced in Egypt, and Paul never goes there. But here's the problem we have, and I'm sorry, it's Easter Sunday. I'm going to keep you all day, but to give you some background, the story of Paul and the content of the authentic Pauline letters that are found in Papyrus 46 is a complete collection. They're all about the money, because in the ancient world, the temple and the state was not only that, but there was no separation between the natural world and the supernatural. This was the supernatural world. And you just grew up knowing that you owed the temple tax to God, and you weren't supposed to know where the money went. Okay? None of that fits the period leading up to 27 AD. None of the Pauline material fits the period between 39 and 62, when it supposedly takes place. Theologically, it makes zero sense of any kind whatsoever. The locations where Paul goes, like he's flying all over this world. None of that makes any sense. It makes perfect sense if you run it forward a few years to after 70, and in particular, between 70 and 73. There's this window of time. So many Romans have joined these synagogues because they've loosened up the membership requirements. And the only reason for the Sadducees, the pseudo-Zaddokites, to start cracking down on that is it's all about the money and who gets it and who doesn't. Because in Rome and in other places, the Roman Empire, the Jews, these people have been given, and the Romans are the ones who call them Jews. The Jews are given a tax break. They're exempt from paying Roman taxes, but they are supposed to pay taxes, the regular temple taxes. Are you with me? Now, Hillel the Elder, who is technically, apparently supposed to be a Pharisee because Paul graduates from his law school, he has come up with this brilliant maneuver. The Jews who live in Judea have a tradition, and there's all over the Middle East. There's the tax jubilee. When a new king comes to the throne, he wipes out the tax debt. Sometimes it's every 7 years. There's a tax jubilee, a debt jubilee. The Roman puppets have started to really reform the Jewish temple, where it's your sins are payable in blood sacrifice. It's really all about the cash. It was always about the cash. Now it's really about the cash. And their tax collectors, they're not Roman procurators. There's no procurator. There's no direct tax collector. There's only a prefect dealing with a client king. That client king is expected to enforce his own laws, which now include bleeding not just poor people, but bleeding the middle class dry. And when I say bleeding them dry, I mean the money. Hillel comes up with a brilliant legal maneuver. The people are demanding a tax jubilee. Can't give them one. The Romans won't let him give them one. What he does is, and this comes down to the inheritance tax. He says the state temple bank of Jerusalem will remit your debts. Everybody thinks that's a tax jubilee, a debt jubilee. It's not. It's just rolling over their debt. There's a new lien holder. And apparently there's some promise being made there that we can forgive your debt. But the Sadducees come up, oh no, the temple can't forgive debts because that would be violating God's law. Not even God can forgive sins because the debt of blood is owed, and if God breaks his own law, he's not God anymore. And this is the argument they start to have. So what happens is this laying off of the debt, this rolling over the debt, now becomes a blood-sucking burden on the backs of all the people, not only in Judea, but Jews who live outside Judea because they're subject to Roman. If you're going to claim the Roman tax deduction, you got to pay the Jewish tax. Later on, they're going to implement, I think this is 73, they implement the Fiscus Judaicus. But until then, you're supposed to pay your blood, your sin blood tax debt to the temple as normal, well, as the new normal. This is what's going on. Now, they aren't just they're not collecting cash anymore because the bank was always a savings account for your patron, your paterfamilias. He's responsible for you. He's responsible for your paying your sin taxes and responsible for taking care of you. He had a cash account there. But these Sadducees are running around in the street saying that's a sin, that's a sin, that's a sin. And they're taking a greasy black charcoal crayon and they're writing it, your citation, like a parking ticket or a traffic ticket. And they write it down in their ledger book. You go home, you have to show this to your patron and he's angry. Well, because they're going to charge him. It's going to go against his account. If he had a savings account, it's dwindling fast. There wasn't any money in there anyway, but now the excuse is why he shows up, why his checks are bouncing is because you don't have any cash in your account because your slaves and your wives and everybody's been running up these sin tax debts. They're bleeding the country dry. And they aren't just bleeding them of cash anymore. They're piling up debts on debts on debts. You heard of Trump's 50-year mortgage, right? This is very similar to that. And Herod is trying to bootstrap Jerusalem into a modern mercantile economy because he could turn this into the hub of the whole syndicate. So he builds the Romans a seaport at I'll show you Caesarea Maritima. It's all borrowed money, and he's buying all these materials and hiring all these craftsmen from the north, from Byblos, from Ephesus, from all these places. They're getting rich off of it. He is taking these file folders full of tax ledgers. The Phoenicians invent double entry accounting. They invent the ledger. They take these, they sew them together. A bundle of 12 large accounts, or a bundle of 144 smaller accounts. And he is using these expectations. Let me explain why this is called money. Because Uncle Sucker has the power and authority to extract taxes from you. Therefore, his promissory notes, based on expectations of future tax revenues he's going to suck out of you, are now considered an asset, like a mortgage. And the only collateral is your life, which in the ancient world was your blood. Your blood is the collateral on a loan that Herod has taken out from one of the super banks in Ephesus. Well, he's doing this through the bank at Leontopolis. And they are taking it's all about putting another wrapper on it. Now, these are collateral for loans from the super banks Ephesus and Corinth for Herod to buy to keep building his things. And as long as nobody audits the books, everything will be fine. And like I said, if you went back to 39 AD and you grabbed a brain-damaged beggar off the street and you pointed to the bank at Lantopolis, if you pointed to the bank in Jerusalem, if you pointed to the Roman Imperial Federal National Reserve Bank of Saturn, if you pointed to the Transnational Syndicate Reserve Bank of Ephesus, of Artemis at Ephesus, if you ask the dumbest person in the street, how much money you think is in there? He'd look at you like you were an idiot. There's no money in there. How do you know that? Because that's the only bank in the country that's not subject to outside auditors. Their books can't be audited by any out. The Romans already had a lot of tax laws, and they're going to reform this. Everybody knew that the state temple banks had no money. It was just everybody knew this, right? Well, let's fast forward to 62 AD. Well, this all has to do with Herod and Caligula taking over the banks. Not just taking over, he's not just moving in and taking over the bank at Lantopolis in Egypt, Alexandria, Egypt, because he owns it. Now it's this takeover of the bank in Jerusalem, because they're linked very closely. The situation is actually diffused in Jerusalem by Herod and Pilate. What's his name? Petronius drags his feet putting the golden statue of Caligula in the Jerusalem temple, because everybody knows this would be a disaster. And he manages to stall until Caligula is assassinated. Now the Sadducees, the pseudo-Zaddokites, they won't let the Pharisees study at their law school. They want to keep the law to themselves. They don't want anybody else to know the law. But the Pharisees, using, we've reconstructed the Codex of Justinian from a concordance. You can construct the Bible from a is it Strong's Concordance? You can reconstruct the Bible. They have been reconstructing the law from the Babylonian Talmud, from other sources. But they keep flunking the totally rigged bar exams put up by the Sadducees. But finally, in 62 AD, by 62 AD, there's a Jacobus the Just, Jacobus the Nazarite, Jacobus the brother of Jesus. Okay, this is James the Just. We have independent, Josephus talks about him. He has finally, and these Sadducees, they have this image of being perfect under the law. Everybody knows that under the robes, okay, if they lifted up their robes, they're not Jews. Everybody knows this. Everybody knows it's a fraud. Everybody knows it's a fraud. He finally passes the bar exam, and he's universally recognized as true keeper of the law, all this stuff. The Sadducees have to let him, the way they word it is, he was even allowed to approach the Holy of Holies alone. Not like a priest, like a high priest. Like he had proven, so they had to let him in. They had to let him in and let him look at the books. This is 62. And he goes outside and he stands on the steps of the temple and he says, "Hey, everybody, we're all getting fucked." And he's right. There is I'll read it to you later. The State Reserve Bank has finally shown their books to an outside auditor, and there is it's worse than a nuclear meltdown. It's a financial meltdown. And it turns out that the dominoes fall from Ireland to India. A lot of Romans have invested in Herod's port at Caesarea Maritima because he has sold bonds. Bonds are expectations of future revenues. Have you ever bought a U.S. Treasury bond? That's what a Treasury bond is, not a Treasury note. That's different. A Treasury bond is a financial instrument. It is an expectation of future revenues. And they are used as collateral to print more of this useless toilet paper. When I tell you that nothing has changed, what I mean is nothing has changed. You go down through history, you can call them Templars, you can call them Muslims, you can call them Christians, you can call them whatever you want. They're all bankers, and it's the same system. I will take you back to 6000 BC and show you how it's not only the same idea over and over again, it's the same people, it's the same club they belong to. We'll talk a lot more about Jesus and the crucifixion. There's truth. It doesn't make any sense, particularly the dates, which they didn't really, if they ever nailed down a date, it's probably a lie. It's probably a disinfo prop. If they nail down a date, it's probably somebody has changed history. And this happens all the time. But if you realize, number one, it's actually set between 70 and 73. And but then you find this story that takes place in 39, but it's not about Jesus. And nobody gets crucified. We really don't know what happens to the guy. We don't know for sure what happens to the guy. But traditionally, he would have been set free. But Flaccus is sitting on a throne of nails with a crown of thorns on his head and the sword of fucking Benjamin hanging over his head. And this is exactly where Caligula puts him on purpose. And he's done the same thing to Pilate. Pilate and Caiaphas find a way out, or whoever. They find a way out for a while. But in 62 AD, an independent auditor is allowed to see the books, and he walks out on the front steps of the bank and says, "We are all getting bucked." And he's right. He's right. The funny thing is, in 66, there's a riot, and they break into the temple and they burn all the books. Most historians have always tried to assume that it was the books of the law. This is what they burned. They burned this. They burned these. What they didn't understand was, this wasn't the Iron Age. This wasn't the ancient world. This was so modern it would make you puke. There are copies of those, of the major accounts. There are mirrored copies, just like today. The Federal Reserve Bank, their only function is they have a copy of your checking account records stored in several places so that you could burn down your bank. Have you ever burned down your bank? It didn't make any difference. Have you ever been to a bank? They look like temples. And the bigger the bank. If you looked at JP Morgan, oh my goodness, this is the greatest building you've ever seen. It must be so stable. They must have so much money in there you could never finish counting it. And what are they covering up? What are they hiding? What are they protecting? The clothes have no emperor. It's all paper money. It's all paper money. They're supposed to have hard cash reserve. And the Romans, as a response to this, by 73, they roll out a whole new raft of banking regulations and tax regulations, and they create a civil service to try to keep this more fair. And Paul isn't just running around offering these investors a bailout, a credit default swap, liquidating toxic assets into phony charities. Under Roman tax law, you're not supposed to directly benefit from a charity you've donated to. Does this sound familiar? And who knows more about this than the syndicate lawyers themselves? In 66, they burned the books. That's when the Romans lose their shit. They're like, well, we better grab that gold because nobody knows who owns it. And they find it takes them 4 years, not 4 years. When 68? 68, it's Titus kicks down the door of the vault, and there's nothing there but ashes. And he claims he found, I don't know, a couple of drachma of silver. His excuse back home, is it Trajan or it's Vespasian now? At some point, Vespasian. He says, well, my soldiers got there first, and they looted the bank, and they got all the money, and they spent it all, and they spent so much money that the price of gold has dropped 50% in this region. That's actually historically true. but there's no trace of gold. What happened was the value of that paper money dropped by 50%. And if you know anything about paper money, if it drops 1%, it's a nuclear meltdown, and the contagion spreads. In fact, this meltdown kind of opens the door to Roman expansion into further east into Seleucid Empire, because the Romans now have a reputation for having some sensible and draconian enforcement of sensible tax and banking laws. The Roman Empire took over the world because they fixed the money. And the funny thing is, and I will show you this, I'll get off here in a minute. I know you're busy. It's Sunday. It's Easter Sunday. You eat your ham. I love ham. Paul is not just restructuring the syndicate as a corporation and not just giving tax shelter to some Romans who lost their asses in this. The Romans seem to have adopted an awful lot of his ideas in their new tax code, in their new banking code. I think Paul, when you actually read the story, Paul wasn't crucified. The last thing we hear of Paul is he's living in Rome in a nice apartment, and he's living a pretty comfortable life. He's pulled it off. I think Paul's epistles, and they're written for the public consumption. There may have been secret practices, but for public consumption, these are, whenever Harvard gets caught, they got some pedophile, and then they come up with a new policy, and then they have to promulgate that policy, and everybody has to take a test, and they carbon copy this whole thing. The policy, you carbon copy this to the regulatory authorities. We have fixed our problem, and the regulatory authorities are now, they can say, okay, we've been told the problem is fixed. This is the documentation. If you've ever been an internal auditor, I have been an internal auditor. You prepare this report, found a problem, company says it's fixed, this is their new company policy and procedures, all employees have been trained on it, all employees have been tested on it, the problem is solved, this is the report I hand in to the regulatory authority. This is how it's done, basically. I think Paul did more than just save people some money. I think he actually was by allowing some Roman senators to participate in this bailout, he's a lobbyist. And if you read his letters, he's saying, what, we should move the bishopric to Rome. He's saying we should move the bank headquarters to Rome, and we should use our influence to reform. We should take over the Roman. And I think to a great extent he actually did. I think he's actually somebody who, I'll get to that later. However, there's an awful lot of Pauline material, and then there's this story. This comes from Luke, right? This whole thing is Luke. Luke is the one who links Jesus to Egypt in the first place. Luke was probably a member of that Alexandrian synagogue. There is one way you can cram that material earlier into the first century, but there's only one way you can do it. The only way that this stuff can be true, and if you allow this one thing to be true, then the rest of this has to be true, and it's all perfectly logical, it's all perfectly proven, it's all perfectly established, it's all perfectly documented. And there's only one way that can be true, and that is if it's all about the money. I'm Professor Thomas Henry Horan, asking you to please stay plugged in to the Stones Unturned podcast.
He reads everything.
Happy Easter, everybody. Say hi to Jesus for me. I will see you very, very soon. Everything's been changed around. They have changed everything on YouTube. Changed everything. I'll see you real soon. Go in peace. End stream. There we go. End